Hello everyone, it's SmartyPants Chess, and this is another CCC11 Finals video with Stockfish playing Leela Chess 0. This is game 141 with Stockfish as white and Leela as black. The game started with d4 knight to f6, c4 c5 and then d5 and e6. So we're into a modern Benoni after knight c3, e takes d5, c takes d5 and then bishop to d6. Knight to f3 was played and then bishop to c7, and this is the end of the book, and the engines now start thinking for themselves. So already I don't really like black's position. The Benoni is a really defensive opening and I've played it a few times. It's very hard for me to play as black, to be honest. It's quite a cramped game for black. The bishops are really hard to develop and it's very hard to gain some space. So straight away I believe Stockfish already has a slight advantage. Stockfish plays e4. Leela plays d6, Stockfish then plays h3, defending the g4 square, stopping bishop g4, and already we see that actually white's got a clamp on the white squares, and it's going to be very hard for black to develop this bishop to a decent square. In the game, Leela castled now, bishop to d3 was played, rook to e8, Stockfish castled, knight bd7 and then bishop to f4, and a6. So Leela is preparing to play b5, Stockfish puts an end to this straight away with the move a4, and I've highlighted this square on e5 with a multitude of arrows here because this is the most important square at this particular moment. So all the black's pieces are converging on the e5 square. They want to drop a knight in at some point, and white's also defending with the bishop and the knight at the same time. So if knight to e5 here, white will probably just recapture it, and after d takes e5, white will have a passed d pawn. The bishop on c7 also inadvertently strikes in at e5 as well. So Leela manoeuvres now, knight to f8. She's preparing to play knight g6, attacking the bishop, and that will also defend this e5 square again as well. Stockfish plays knight to d2 to reroute their knight to c4. Knight g6 is played and the bishop drops back to g3. Leela really wants to play b5, so she plays rook b8, preparing this move and gaining some space. And now Stockfish has some options. Rook e1 was what they played in the game. f4 was also another potential candidate move here. And it's very hard for black to manoeuvre here. So if bishop d7, white has a lot of space to play moves like queen f3. If b5, they can just play b3. Don't have to take that b5 pawn off. Bishop b6 and king h1. c4, b takes c4 and bishop to d4. This was what was given in my Stockfish at home. These are considered the best moves. And after rook ac1, b takes a4, white should now play c5. If bishop takes e5, white has a great game after e5. Black can't really take this pawn on e5 because if d takes e5, there's bishop takes g6, h takes g6 and then f takes e5. White has an amazing centre with these two pawns dominating the position. The best move here is actually bishop to d4. The point is if white takes on f6, black can play rook e3 and has a very nice game. But after bishop d4, white should play knight c to e4. If d takes e5, there's knight takes f6 with check, queen takes, knight to e4, attacks the queen. If the queen moves, then there's knight to d6, queen f6, and then white can take an exchange and play rook c7. And white has a clear advantage in this position and in the game. So after rook b8 in the game, f4 was perfectly possible for Stockfish to play. However, they seem to have deemed rook e1 a better move. Leela continued with bishop to d7, so finally develops this awkward bishop. The knight jumps in to c4, and finally Leela plonks her knight onto e5. I think white can take this knight with knight takes e5, d takes e5, and then maybe white can play bishop h4 and play it like this, pin the knight on f6. This forces probably Leela to play h6 to prepare g5. If queen f3, g5, bishop g3 and king g7. Again, white's doing fine, you can play queen e2. If queen e7, then white can just play moves like b3. If bishop a5, then rook to c1. And black's very forced to now attack with g4. Takes, f3, attacking the knight. If the knight jumps back, then just bishop h4 again to pin the knight. In this position it's given that white has ever so slightly a better position. So if we just go back to the game, it's perfectly acceptable for white to take this knight off. But Stockfish just didn't want to do that. Instead they just consolidate their position, just play b3 instead. and white's still got a very nice game. Leela does play h6 though, maybe preempting this bishop h4 idea. Stockfish continued queen d2, and finally Leela plays b5, attacking the knight on c4. So white's now forced to move this knight away, and so Stockfish decides to take the knight on e5, and after d takes e5, just play queen to e2. So now white's got a passed d pawn and definitely has a superior advantage here. After queen e2, they're also threatening to play a takes b5, so black's forced to take on a4. Knight takes a4 is played, and then black takes on a4. The pawn recaptures, and Leela plays rook to b4, trying to gain some counterplay. Now black's got a decent game, but white's ever slightly better. So again, they've got the passed d pawn, and black's got these two weak isolated pawns at the moment. Actually, three isolated pawns, I should say. And it's going to be very difficult for black to defend all three of these pawns. So Stockfish straight away attacks one of them, rook to c1. This forces Leela to defend. Defends all three of them at this moment in time because this bishop actually does a good job of defending this e4 pawn, so she can't go pawn grabbing on a6. Rook a2 was played by Stockfish. Leela plays rook eb8, doubling rooks, and now Stockfish plays rook a to c2. In the game, Leela defended the pawn on c5 with bishop to b6. I was thinking rook takes a4 looks okay, doesn't it? But no, actually rook takes c5 is devastating because it attacks the bishop. If the bishop jumps back, white can play rook to c8. After rook a b4, white's got a superior advantage and black's got a lot of problems. After queen a2, for instance, threatens to play queen takes a6. If knight to d7, then white can play rook to c6, attacking the queen. If the queen goes to e7, then there's d6, queen f6, rook takes rook, rook takes, and then just queen a6. And this is a very nice game for white to be in. So if we go back to the game, black shouldn't really go pawn grabbing in this instance. So instead Leela plays the wise move, bishop to b6 and defends the pawn. And Stockfish asks another question to play a5, attacking the bishop on b6. Again, if black goes pawn grabbing, bishop takes a5, we get into a similar position with rook takes c5, bishop d8 and then rook to c6, queen e7 and rook takes a6, and white's just a clean pawn up with a passed d pawn. A very easy middle game for white to play. So after a5, bishop a7 was indeed played by black, and Stockfish plays bishop to c4, just blocking out this rook on b4 from attacking the e4 pawn. Leela plays rook a4, and Stockfish plays an interesting move, rook to d2. The point of rook d2 is it supports the d pawn, so if black now takes again this a5 pawn and goes pawn grabbing, white can play f4, preparing f takes e5. If knight to d7, there's f takes e5, knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and because the rook's behind this pawn, they can play d6. And now this pawn is quickly marching up the board for whites. If Leela continued with rook a1, then they can just take twice, king h2, queen e5, g3 to block the check, king f8, and white has moves like rook to d5. If queen b2, rook d2, queen e5 and just h4. And again, white can play rook d5 at some point and start pushing this d7 pawn. Also, this c5 pawn is isolated, blocks this bishop in, which isn't great. And white can actually take a6 at their leisure if black decides to keep it there. So this is a good advantage for white to be in. So rook d2 was a very nice move for white to play. So Leela didn't go pawn grabbing though, she played rook a3. Stockfish played rook to d3, and actually now Leela does take on a5 with the rook, and this allows Stockfish again to play f4, which is what happened in the game. If he takes f4 here, then white just plays e5. And if black tries to be clever with queen e6, because this pins the e-pawn, white can also try d6. If queen e8 to maintain the pin on the e-file against the queen, so white can't take this knight off because the queen's pinned. Then just queen d2 though attacks the rook on a5, and now the pawn is threatening to take the knight on f6, so black will lose material. Instead of taking, Leela played knight to d7. Stockfish captured on e5, the knight recaptured, the bishop took, and then the queen recaptured. And again, white's got this passed d-pawn ready to roll up the board. This is the key to white's success, and will probably win white the game. Stockfish is very crafty now, plays queen f1. The point is, after d6, the bishop will eye up this f7 pawn along with the queen. So Leela defends this f7 pawn with the rook. White goes d6, unleashes the bishop on c4. Bishop to b8 was played by Leela, attacking the pawn on d6. But now just rook d5 attacks the queen, so the queen forced to move to g3. And this leaves white able to play e5, supporting this d6 pawn. And this pawn is very high up the board now. So black's got to be very careful. Leela continued with rook to a3. Again, this is quite a crafty move because let's say white takes on a6, then black can play rook takes a6, queen takes a6, and then there's queen e3 at the end, where black will win material. So if we just go back here, white's got to be a bit careful, so Stockfish goes king h1. It stops any checks for black on the dark squares. Leela plays rook to e3, attacks the e5 pawn, but now just queen f5 to defend. If Leela continued to attack this e5 pawn with rook to e8, then white can just play rook takes c5, attacking the f7 pawn twice. This is pretty much game over because if rook e1 just takes twice, king h2, rook f8 to defend f7, but then just bishop takes f7 anyway. After rook takes f7, there's rook c8 check, rook f8, and then rook takes f8 is checkmate. So going back to position after queen to f5, Leela played king h8, white played rook to f1, again ganging up on this f7 pawn, rook e1 is played by Leela, and then there's a trade of rooks, king h2 to get off the check, and then Leela continued with queen h4. So Stockfish is in the driving seat now, and Stockfish just cleans up. Bishop takes a6, grabs another pawn, may as well. g6 to attack the queen, but then just queen to f3. King g8 is played, and now g3, attacking the queen. Leela moves her queen to b4, and Stockfish though defends everything with queen to e2, defends the bishop and supports the e5 pawn, and there's no checks on the second rank. Leela plays h5, Stockfish goes bishop c4, and Leela tries h4, just trying to build up some counterplay, double the h pawns, but Stockfish is happy to take this off. There's no perpetual checks here. King g7 by Leela, queen f1, threatens to play queen to f6, so this forces Leela to actually play f6 themselves and unleash their rook on f8 if they can. But now Stockfish is very clever, they play h5, so this just dismantles black's pawn structure completely. If Leela decides to check here with queen to b2, then king h1, f takes e5 doesn't work because then white has a crafty h6 move with check. If king g8, then there's rook takes e5 with check from the bishop on c4. If king h7, white can win with rook to e7 check, king takes h6, queen takes f8 is check, and it will be mate in a few moves. So going back, Leela actually played queen c3 instead of queen b2. Stockfish played queen f4 to defend the bishop on c4. Leela now does check the king, but then after king g1, queen to b1 and bishop to f1, there's no more checks for black. Leela plays queen to e1 to get behind the pawn. Stockfish plays king to g2. And again there's no checks for black here, so Leela goes to queen to b1. And now it's Stockfish's turn. E takes f6 with check, rook takes f6, and then Stockfish plays h6 with check. If the king moves away, then white will take the rook on f6, so king f7 is forced. And Stockfish plays a nice move, queen to c4. The point is now the queen's going to deliver a discovered attack against the king if the rook ever moves. But Leela is a bit crafty as well, plays queen to b7 to pin the rook on d5. But now Stockfish can just sidestep this with king to g1, and now the discovered attack is maintained against the king. Queen d7 was played in the game, and Stockfish can play rook to f5 with check from the queen on c4. Queen e6 blocks the check, but now Stockfish again is very crafty. Rook to e5, attacks the queen on e6 with the rook, and the queen is actually pinned by the queen on c4. So Leela takes the queen, bishop takes c4 with check, and this is pretty much game over now, because if king f8 here, white can just play a move like d7, And the point is that rook to e8 will be checkmate, and if white gets a queen with d8, that's also checkmate. So there's nothing black can do in this position. That's actually a very nice finish if white could get into it. But after bishop takes c4, black just played rook to e6 to block, and Stockfish now just finishes off with rook takes e6, bishop a7, and rook to e7 check, king f6, h7, bishop to b8, and gets a queen. And after a few more moves, it's game over. Stockfish delivers a very nice checkmate with rook to e3 and finishes Leela off. So this was a very nicely played game by Stockfish. I don't think the opening is amazing for black. Again, it squashes black, and throughout the whole game Stockfish had this nice d-pawn, which you can see here on d6 just blocks out this bishop on b8. But a very nicely played game by Stockfish, and in the final game that I'll look at, it'll be reverse colours, so we'll see how Leela does with white and how black does playing the Benoni. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Please drop a like, comment or subscribe if you did, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.